Dear viewers, Alexander Ivanovich, I too have taken the liberty of dedicating some time to studying this issue. Allow me to share with you some thoughts, observations, and notes. Some things may be repetitive, but I will try to outline the following sections. First, I will discuss what happened in April 1970. Then, I'll share a series of reflections and comparisons of the facts related to what occurred in September, perhaps with some surprises for you and other like-minded people. Lastly, we will attempt to summarize by overlaying all these events onto the period of 1969-70. Why was all of this necessary? If I may, I will continue.
With great pleasure.
So, I titled my report, On Some Oddities Around Murmansk. By Murmansk, in this case, we mean that very episode in early September 1970. It should be noted that cooperation in the field of space exploration, or, more broadly, cooperation surrounding space, between the USSR and the USA began in 1962 when an agreement was signed between the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union and NASA. However, from 1962 onward, almost nothing happened. Once in a while, they'd exchange commemorative pennants, and that was pretty much it. Attention! This was the state of affairs before April 1970. Now, together with you, let's take a look at what was happening up until that point and in April 1970 itself. So, on April 11th, the Saturn rocket was launched, allegedly carrying Apollo 13. Here is its diagram, with the specific emphasis on the placement of the very command module. What do we know from official data? The launch took place on April 11th, and the spacecraft landed on April 17, 1970. Now about the important things and news articles. On April 16, 1970, newspapers published a telegram from the Premier of the Soviet Union, Alexei Kosygin, to U.S. President Nixon. This is significant because, formally, the head of the USSR's executive power was Kosygin as the Premier. It's worth noting that when Kosygin sent this telegram on April 15, he stated that the USSR government would do everything possible to assist in the search and rescue of the Apollo 13 crew upon their return to Earth, if such assistance were needed. At the same time, Air Force Deputy Chief of Combat Training for Space, Kamanin, ordered all available spacecraft search equipment to be prepared. The Soviet government issued a direct directive to both military and civilian organizations in the USSR to take all necessary measures to assist in rescuing the American astronauts, should the need arise. This is important. Both military and civilian organizations were involved. Why? I'll explain further. Here are several publications from the archive, digitized for reference. By April 15, 12 countries had already expressed their sympathy to the U.S. leadership and offered assistance in rescuing the astronauts upon their return to Earth. Among them was the Soviet Union. This is from the archive, and it's specifically shown here that in the same issue of the New York Times, emphasizing the issue from April 16, there were several articles. In addition to the official announcement that many countries, 75 in total, had expressed readiness to help the U.S. with the rescue efforts, there were also separate articles discussing Soviet activities at the time. One of these articles, published in the same issue, was authored by James F. Clarity. He wrote that Soviet ships were ready to assist. It's worth mentioning that some letters were misrecognized by automated text recognition tools used in digital archives. A link to the website is provided. This article mentions that the Soviet Union dispatched 2 ships to the possible landing site of Apollo 13. The article even provides their names, which we will list later. Additionally, the same issue features another piece listing these ships: Academic Rikachov and Novopolotsk. Take note, 3 related reports in one issue. Moving on, A day later, the New York Times, a leading U.S. publication, reported that the Soviet Union had sent 2 more ships. One of them belonged to the Navy's long-range fleet, ready to assist if needed when Apollo 13 was scheduled to splash down in the Pacific Ocean later that day. The Soviet ships were already on standby. This particular article is also shown here. On April 17, the day of Apollo 13's return, the New York Times published another piece highlighting the solidarity of Soviet cosmonauts with the American astronauts supposedly in the capsule. Everyone genuinely empathized with them. It was a professional bond and, on a human level, entirely understandable. Incidentally, Alexander Ivanovich, have you ever noticed the size of news reports about the Soviet Union? A copy of the entire newspaper spread is presented here, with the red rectangle marking the size of the article that mentions the Soviet cosmonauts' wishes for the safe return of the Americans. Now, who besides the New York Times reported in April that the Soviet Union expressed solidarity at the level of its leadership and ordinary citizens, with cosmonauts acting as representatives of the latter? Everyone sympathized. It's essential to understand the complex circumstances. Regional press coverage is also notable. Using modern archival technology, we've retrieved the following materials. For example, the Columbus Telegram, dated April 15, has an article on its front page. The same layout is shown here, the full spread on the right, and a close-up of the piece on the left, with the corresponding size highlighted. Similarly, the Delta Democrat Times, also dated April 15, 1970, from Greenville, Mississippi, features a front-page article. It mentions Kosygin and the Soviet Union prominently. On the very first page and in large print, a rarity. The piece is titled, "Soviets Offer Rescue Help." Now, moving on, there were numerous articles and other publications on this topic. I'll provide some statistics a bit later. I made a slide with 6 articles dated different days. April 15, Wisconsin, front page. April 15, Georgia, front page. April 15, Minnesota, front page. All the pages are indicated, just copies from the archive. April 16, Kentucky, second page. April 16, Virginia, 28th page. April 16, South Carolina, 5th page. And there were many such articles. As the date of the Soviet Union's telegram publication recedes, the coverage becomes diluted. While everything seems transparent and fine, the significance of the event gradually diminishes. The primary message from the New York Times is copied into the same electronic archive. A search button is clicked, and the following result appears. The regional U.S. press published 508 articles regarding the USSR's offer of assistance. This is what has been digitized and made available in the electronic archive. However, among the top publications, only the New York Times covered it. As we saw from the dates, on April 15, the stories were on the front pages, but later they were pushed to the back pages, among the chicken leg ads, as you mentioned. So, what happens on April 17? The landing site of the Apollo 13 command module was in a remote area, nearly deserted. Some islands were nearby, but there was little maritime activity. It's approximately the same location where spacecraft are now sunk. A map is provided here. This is an official image. What do we know from official reports? On April 17, 1970, at 5:53 p.m., the Apollo 13 crew module re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. At 5:58 p.m., it re-established communication, and at 6:07 p.m., it successfully splashed down 6.5 kilometers from the amphibious assault ship Iwo Jima. All crew members of Apollo 13 were flown to Honolulu, Hawaii, a U.S. territory in the Pacific Ocean. This is the official version. But what happened around all of this? Here's a photo of the crew, taken on April 11th and allegedly on April 17th after the splashdown. Notice the photo on the right, dated April 17th. The sea is almost completely calm, and visibility is excellent. Let's explore how this might have influenced events. At the same time, the Ocean 70 naval exercises were taking place, as Alexander Ivanovich mentioned. Here is the photograph you showed, but it's not from April. This image is from the start of the Navy's deployment in preparation for these exercises. It is reliably known that this photo was taken in January 1970. That means our forces occupied all the necessary areas as part of what you referred to as a cover operation, 2 to 3 months before the exercises began. Now, an important point. Officially, the exercises took place from April 14th to May 5th, 1970. In major electronic libraries, you will only find information stating that they were officially conducted in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In reality, our squadron also operated in the Indian Ocean, as it is known that during these exercises, our ships made a goodwill port call in Mauritius. This definitely does not pertain to either the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceans. Why is this significant? As mentioned, the Soviet government issued directives to military and civilian organizations in the USSR to take all necessary measures to assist in the rescue of American astronauts, if needed. Consequently, 4 ships were dispatched to the presumed splashdown site: Academic Rikachov, Novomoskossk, and Trawler 8452. Unfortunately, only this designation is known so far.
At the time, many trawlers were being retrofitted into reconnaissance vessels.
This may be the case, but for now, we are dealing with verified facts. Here, I have created a slide with photographs of these ships. 3 of them are reliably identified and shown: the motor vessel Academic Rikachov, the motor vessel Novomoskossk, the measurement and tracking ship Chumi Khan, and the trawler 8452. Its image might have some inaccuracies, but the ship class is definite. This means it was precisely such a ship that was sent by order of the Soviet leadership. What do we know from memoirs and literature about this episode? In 2008, the book, Project 1130 by Kurachkin and Chardin was published by the Military Book Publishing House. Here's a quote. On April 17, 1970, the Soviet ship Chumi Khan arrived in the splashdown area, attention, earlier than the others. But at the request of the Americans, it remained adrift at a distance of 30 kilometers to avoid interfering with the Iwo Jima's search for the command module. This mentions the 30-kilometer distance. There were other publications, and I will take the liberty of quoting one. A newspaper article is shown here, and the quote is fairly clear. On the evening of April 15, 1970, the ship's commander, Captain First Rank Trunin, tasked me with determining the shortest route and time of arrival at a point southeast of the Western Samoa Islands. This referred to the presumed splashdown site of the capsule. Chumi Khan suddenly left its drift position and proceeded at maximum speed. An hour later, a communications officer whispered me that the ship had received a radiogram marked, of state importance, signed by Brezhnev, Podgorny, and Grechko, instructing us to ensure the rescue of the Apollo 13 spacecraft and its 3 astronauts. But 50 minutes before arriving at the splashdown point, a directive was issued from Moscow. Halt the movement and avoid interfering with the U.S. ship's rescue operation. An expert calculation, cited in various sources, concluded that the ship was approximately 22 kilometers from the anticipated location. The source is cited, so it can be verified if necessary. One source mentions that the ship received the order to stop at a distance of about 30 kilometers, while another puts it at 22 kilometers. The figures are close, and the fact itself is undisputed. So, what kind of vessel was the Chumi Khan? She was a Project 1130 ship. You can see her now. This is it. The Chumi Khan was a measurement and tracking ship. Her primary purpose was to support the monitoring of intercontinental ballistic missile tests. This military ship was equipped with state-of-the-art electronics and staffed with the best specialists at the time. Special regulations stipulated that a Ka-25TL helicopter was supposed to be stationed on board, though whether it was present at the moment is unknown. However, the radio-transparent dome, visible as the sphere on top, housing the main antenna, was undoubtedly present. Such a formidable vessel moved and positioned herself within a couple of dozen kilometers of the anticipated splashdown point. It's also worth noting her main specifications listed on the right. She was 49 meters tall with a draft of approximately 7.5 meters. The importance of these details will soon become evident. At the same time, the helicopter carrier Iwo Jima was en route to the anticipated Apollo 13 splashdown site. Such vessels do not operate without accompanying groups, which include submarines. Here are her photo and drawings. Interestingly, there is a table showing the deviation of Apollo splashdown locations from their calculated points. When Iwo Jima allegedly recovered Apollo 13, she approached within 6.5 kilometers of the module. Notably, the deviation of Apollo 13's command module from its calculated splashdown point was only 1.9 kilometers. Imagine, according to their narrative, these people flew in space for 6 days in a burning and leaking spacecraft and landed precisely at the planned location, where they were supposed to arrive. The re-entry capsule of Apollo 13 was designed to slow down in its final descent with the help of a two-stage parachute system. According to American documentation, the process was as follows. At an altitude of 24,000 feet, 7,300 meters, two small drogue parachutes deployed to decelerate and stabilize the module. At 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters, three main orange and white parachutes opened to guide Odyssey, the codename for this mission, safely to the Pacific Ocean. We usually see them at the end. Photographic evidence from April 17, 1970, shows the parachutes in action from a distance. The first parachutes deployed at an altitude of 7 kilometers. Our ship, Chumi Khan, was stationed 22 kilometers away. Alexander Ivanovich, is it possible to photograph the event or at least observe it using electronic instruments? Let's examine what happened there. A well-known fact, often taught even to 4-year-old children, is that due to the curvature of the Earth, our visual range is limited. Standard calculations and practice suggest that from a height of 15 meters, one can see up to 21 kilometers. We noted the height of Chumi Khan in its technical specifications for a reason. From the platform at the base of her radio-transparent dome, could one use marine binoculars to observe what's happening 22 kilometers away? Surely, Iwo Jima would have been visible. The question then arises, where are the documented records of this event, if it occurred? Both on the American and Soviet sides, there has never been any public declaration of observational data, yet such data must have existed. At the very least, telemetry and photo-video documentation would have been collected. Furthermore, the Americans would certainly have photographed Chumi Khan from Iwo Jima. She was a helicopter carrier, and her helicopters were actively flying.
A naval intelligence officer, a senior seaman who served in the Pacific Fleet, personally showed me a photograph of the Honolulu coastline, those very Hawaiian islands. It was taken from a distance of about 20 kilometers.
So, the numbers are comparable? Is everything clearly visible?
Yes, absolutely. You can see yachts, windows, everything very clearly.
Can you confirm windows are visible?
Yes, the windows are visible.
So, an object the size of the Apollo 13 capsule,
You can see every balcony perfectly.
And the Americans don't have anything similar. All their images are only taken from close range. So, where did we start? That cooperation in space exploration between the USSR and the USA hadn't progressed much since 1962. But suddenly, everything changed in April 1970. Now, allow me to quote from someone else's recorded speech. In April 1970, during an informal conversation between academician Anatoly Blagan-Ravov, pictured here, and Dr. Thomas Paine, then head of NASA, our Academy of Sciences, their NASA, the situation improved. Dr. Paine, concerned about the emergency faced by the Apollo 13 crew, who had just successfully returned to Earth, inquired about the possibility of cooperation to ensure the safety of manned spacecraft crews. The proposal was warmly received and discussed in scientific circles in both countries. It was also welcomed by the astronauts themselves. Let me highlight the key words. Inquired about the possibility of cooperation to ensure the safety of manned spacecraft crews. Note, this was after the crew had safely returned to Earth. So why reach out after their return? Because of the involvement of the Chumi Khan. But were these the only strange events? Let's move from April to September 1970. A little earlier today, Alexander Ivanovich already showed us that very famous publication of the photograph. It's important to note, the caption states that the photo was taken by the Hungarian news agency and provided by Nandor Shuminsky, whom you mentioned earlier regarding the telegram. Things get even more intriguing. Speaking of publications, on September 4th, the New York Times reported that the Soviets announced the transfer of an experimental U.S. Apollo capsule. It's written right here.
I must admit, this seems unclear to me. The fact is, all capsules are experimental. They represent the cutting edge of science and technology, and every one of them is experimental.
Alexander Ivanovich, there are no quotation marks here. This is an interpretive take. By the way, the photo is shown.
I don't dispute your points, but the phrasing itself.
The role and placement of this message in the U.S. information landscape, in this case on the pages of the New York Times, are also illustrated by its location in the bottom left corner of the large spread in the September 5, 1970 issue. Page 16. That's how significant this announcement was. Now, who else besides the New York Times? Again, from various archives. For example, a report dated September 4th appeared in a local newspaper, Deseret News. However, this time the second page. Then there's Kingsport Times News, from the September 5th issue, featuring the text you mentioned. But there were additional publications. For instance, a report from September 6 also mentioned that the Russians had found the capsule and planned to return it. That particular slide you referred to, among chicken leg, the one with the comparison of the placement of these stories in the New York Times and in 3 regional American publications. But it wasn't limited to just these 3. Take, for example, a story in the Milwaukee Journal from September 8, 1970, or the piece in the Tipton Daily Tribune. We saw it in the general slide. At least this one, dated September 9th, is on page 10 and even includes the TASS photograph provided via UPI with Hungarian authorship. What else? There's a report in the Tennessean from September 7th on page 8. As you mentioned, tucked among chicken leg advertisements, though in this case, it was in the tailoring ads. Then there's something on page 26 in a North Carolina publication from September 7th, presented in a similar manner. And page 8 of a Kentucky publication dated September 5th. California, page 10. If you use an electronic library and make a detailed search, writing in English, for example, Soviets returned Apollo capsule from Murmansk, as stated in official reports, Over 100 publications can be found just in regional press. They're even categorized by state.
В региональной только прессе более 100 публикаций. Они даже тут у них по штатам приведены.
If you simplify the query, using broader terms like Murmansk, Apollo 13, you'll find over 1,000 mentions. As of now, the digitized electronic archive lists 1,896 responses. Interestingly, the highest number of mentions ties to Pennsylvania Regional Press, with over 150 reports. What's also notable about this photograph? A specific recurrence. More importantly, the source cited at the bottom right of the slide. We'll discuss it soon. Other publications also covered this, not just American ones. British media, for example, reported on the journey of the ship Southwind. One such article appeared in the Baltimore Sun on November 22, showing a map of the ship's route. Here's a newspaper clipping. There's a photograph of the ship already in the ice, navigating with the capsule. Another image from the ship's deck shows the crew clearing ice. Why is this important? Because the caption notes the photo was scanned from the ship's logbook. Later, we'll explore more from these sources. For example, there's a photograph of the crew posing with the capsule amidst the ice, also scanned from the team's materials. Here are the publications in the British press. At least 3 are known. November 18, 21, and 22, in the Evening Sun, Navy Times, and Baltimore Sun, respectively. What do enthusiasts of our cause, researchers not only in Russia but in many countries, pay attention to? For instance, in these 3 British newspapers, there are stories about how British sailors navigate the Northern Sea route, bravely fighting wind and ice. Yet not a single mention of the capsule appears in any of the articles, as if it had been forgotten. Here's another photo from the ship's log, the same one with the capsule. You'll notice there's no ice anymore. It's titled Home for Christmas. This is also from their documents. That is, the handover took place on September 5, and home for Christmas likely means a port call around December 21 to 22. Why was it planned this way? Because the Christmas and New Year holidays were approaching, and it would be sidelined by other concerns. What would the media campaigns in all the newspapers focus on?
Geese.
Well, geese and how to keep moving forward. In short, all this would be buried in the noise. In this regard, they handled it smartly.
They did indeed.
Now, how do we know all of this? Alexander Ivanovich mentioned today, The Hungarians, a book from 1981. It specifically notes that photographs were taken and some materials were published nearly a decade earlier. Let's take a look. This is the now familiar figure, Nandor Shuminsky. Big thanks to him for compiling a vast archive of over 10,000 photographs. But does it end there? No. Alexander Ivanovich mentioned in his report another Hungarian, Fahir, who took some photographs. Alexander Ivanovich, I must slightly disagree, and I'll explain why. In the ship's electronic archive on its website, which is referenced here, there are photographs taken by the crew. This is the official archive, and the link is provided. Among them are photos ending with the numbers 343 and 345. You see, there are different names mentioned there: Nandor Shuminsky and Tomasz Fahir. However, it's important to note that many photographs and documents were scanned and later processed using OCR, optical character recognition. The letter H could have been misinterpreted or stretched. In fact, the person's name was Finner. He was a rather well-known Hungarian photographer specializing in artistic journalism even back then. A gifted individual, he was already teaching in higher education institutions in Hungary and later at a university. All of this is documented, and it's written in Esperanto, a very fashionable language in the art community at the time. In the bottom right corner of the document, marked in red, are the places where his works were exhibited. Before the publication of the 1981 book, he exhibited in neighboring countries such as Serbia, the USSR, and Cuba. After the book's release, his exhibitions were almost exclusively in Western Europe. Why? That could be an entirely separate discussion, including the question of why Hungary played a role here. At the very least, we have two individuals who took photos, Shuminsky and Fener. Now, another fact. We already know that the head of NASA resigned a week later, but there were still some highly significant events to come. Let's revisit April 1970 while constructing a certain version of events. This can be criticized, of course, but there are simply too many intriguing coincidences. Afterward, we'll return to the second half of 1970. According to one version widely discussed online, during the Ocean 70 exercises, as part of a cover operation to transport the capsule to Murmansk, naval vessels were involved, including our nuclear submarine and a certain trawler named Appetit. This theory circulates in various sources. Speaking of Appetit, here are photos of the captain, hero of socialist labor Ivan Shankov, and at the time, the ship's senior mechanic Alexander Andreev. Why mention this now? Because the indexed journal Cosmonautics News published an article in issue 6, 2015, detailing Andreev's account as an eyewitness to certain events. He wrote that in June 1969, watchmen aboard Appetit discovered a floating object in the ocean, which they allegedly lifted aboard. For some reason, they immediately identified it as an American capsule. How they knew that so quickly is a big question, but the details lie elsewhere. In 2003, that is, 12 years before that, the same journal published an article titled Pages of History in a different issue. Here is the full excerpt from the article, which contains Blagov's recollections. I highlighted 2 paragraphs in red, and to the right is the same text in larger letters. At the beginning of 1970, during sea trials off the coast of Great Britain, a full-scale mock-up simulator of the command module was lost in the fog. In other words, in another issue of Cosmonautics News, the authors referred to 1970 instead of 1969. Furthermore, Blagov's recollections describe how they went there and likely looked inside. Thus, the same reputable journal provides 2 different versions. Is this the official publication of Roscosmos? Am I correct, Alexander Ivanovich, that it is affiliated with Roscosmos? At the very least, online versions of these journals are hosted on the Roscosmos website, and I sourced the materials from there. In these 2 articles, there are 2 versions of when the capsule was retrieved, 1969 or 1970. No clarity is provided, and different accounts circulate. In other words, the version remains unstable, meaning someone needs this ambiguity for some reason. Moreover, how did it get there? The mock-up simulator is explicitly mentioned. How could it have ended up there? It is also known, and there are photographs, that such objects could be dropped from an American aircraft in roughly this manner and then recovered. But that would be rather mundane, as other scenarios exist, with 2 possible variations. In the Pacific Ocean on April 17, a capsule could have been dropped. It was empty, and the Chumi Khan documented it. There were no astronauts on board. At most, it was an empty metal shell that was thrown. The second possibility is that there wasn't even a capsule. There was nothing there, and the Chumi Khan documented it all. That's why these details were never publicly disclosed. The Chumi Khan recorded how the Iwo Jima and its escort ships simply cruised around the southern part of the Pacific Ocean. I reiterate, the results of these observations were never publicly declared. One more fact. A contemporary publication mentions that on October 26 to 27, 1970, a month and a half after the events we know about in Murmansk, the first meeting of Soviet and American specialists took place to address the compatibility compatibility of rendezvous and docking systems for manned spacecraft and space stations. During the meeting, working groups were established to develop and coordinate technical requirements for ensuring the compatibility of these systems. At the same time, there are academic publications on this topic. Allow me to quote one. The first meeting of Soviet and American specialists took place on October 26 to 27. The delegations were headed by Dr. Gilruth, director of the Johnson Space Center, representing the American side, and academician Boris Petrov, chairman of the Intercosmos Council of the USSR Academy of Sciences, representing the Soviet side. Working groups were formed to develop and coordinate technical requirements to ensure compatibility between Soviet and American spacecraft. Quite the progress. In April, they just discussed their concerns, and a month and a half after the Murmansk episode, working groups were already formed. Very odd, isn't it, Alexander Ivanovich? Now, what exactly were they discussing? This could also be of interest. So, Petrov and Gilruth headed these efforts. At the first meeting, it was decided to establish 3 joint groups of specialists to develop the fundamental principles of docking. The first group, led by Konstantin Bushuev on our side and Glyn Lunny on the American side, dealt with the technical aspects of spacecraft design to enable rendezvous and docking. For 10 years, there was no progress, and suddenly, a month and a half later, they were talking about docking. The second group focused on compatibility between Soviet and American guidance, control, and communication systems. It was headed by Viktor Legostayev and Donald Cheatham. The third group worked on the design of the docking mechanism and the transfer tunnel between the spacecraft. It was led by Vladimir Seremyadnikov on our side and Donald Wade on the American side. By 1970, these groups were already interacting with one another. Visits were made to both Star City in the USSR and Houston in the USA. People began communicating informally, even visiting each other's families. There are many peculiarities surrounding all of this. As you speculated, there was some purpose behind it. Perhaps there was indeed that grand collusion we discussed here a year ago, in September 2023. We could create an entirely new broadcast about this, as there's enough material for it. If there's interest, we can dedicate time to it.